Module 2 is looking at psychometrics, screening instruments, and eligibility for identification as a student with ASD. The information is covered in your textbooks in Chapter 2 of Wilkinson and portions of Chapter 3 in Goldstein. The page is noted here. The remainder of that chapter will be covered in Module 3. First, to define screening. Screening is a first step in an attempt to delay identification of students that there's an uncertainty about. In other words, some red flags have appeared, but there's not real certainty, and this is a step one. The reason it's important in the context of students with autism spectrum disorders is with regard primarily at school age time with those students who are high functioning. Those are the students who may still be undiagnosed when they enter school. You might see them now referred to in the literature as HFASD. Once again, it's important to remember that the change in definition, according to DSM-5 of the diagnostic criteria, is what's making screening important now. So we're looking at screening a little bit differently. And it's important for positive outcomes. It's important for parents to feel less stress if they're concerned about a student and nothing seems to be happening with regard to assessment. And it can also begin the implementation of effective strategies much sooner. The categorical, again, subtypes have gone away with the new definition. So now we're looking at a dimensional approach to the whole spectrum of autism spectrum disorders. So there's no distinct entities any longer, instead, it's a continuum without those discrete subtypes. Each individual on that spectrum, irregardless of their location on the spectrum, of course, is incredibly unique. So again, we're collecting data that might lead to a referral. In this context, we're using that term referral in the special education school psychology kind of context of that's when you're going to initiate a full-blown evaluation, the evaluation that requires all of the procedures to kick into place and the parental signed permission, of course. The diagnostic evaluation, those are the assessments necessary to definitely make the diagnoses, and this can happen in a variety of settings, medical or psychiatric, psychological, or at school with the school psychologist. The ongoing assessment that we're referring to here is a core of this course, which is what we continually do with students on the spectrum to measure their growth and to assure really appropriate future planning as well. What you'll see in the future slides following this slide are several instruments specifically identified. It has been hard to screen for the much milder variants of autism for, I think, very obvious reasons. So we don't screen every child, obviously, but should look at students who have presented with risk factors and demonstrated particular red flags that we'll talk about next. The risk factors are typically sibling and family history of autism. Very new research coming out of funding from Autism Speaks has recognized that while there are definitely family history issues, genetic issues in many cases of this diagnosis, the exact genes involved vary tremendously. So they looked at families with at least 2 children identified in the same family and looked individually at their genes and found that there was only, that there was not any overlap in the differences in the genetic identification of these students in 70% of the students. And otherwise, 70% of them couldn't be traced to a uniform specific kind of genetic flag. However, the doctor who headed up the research suggested this means that there are actually many, many different autisms. And so it just speaks again to the complicated diagnosis of the disorder from the medical perspective. The red flags that you may see at school or may be brought to you as a concern if you're a psychologist at school are the student dealing with social concerns that point towards the possibility of this diagnosis, communication concerns, and also behavioral concerns. Those three big domains of concern with this diagnosis. Your chapters look, both of them give you a bit of psychometric information, and I've added several kind of references in the module for you to look at. We're looking here at the screening and with a lot of the assessment for autism, more at questionnaire types of instruments, and so the scoring is a little bit different. The concerns, however, around validity and reliability, of course, never go away. In these kinds of screeners that are often people answering questions on a scale, we're concerned about the sensitivity and the specificity. In other words, is the instrument sensitive enough to pick up the children who in fact are on the spectrum based on those questions and their answers? And is it specific enough to recognize students who do not fit on the spectrum as a regard of use of the instrument? So here we're basically talking about false negatives and false positives being minimalized to the greatest degree possible. And that's also, obviously based on the psychometrics. So what's acceptable? There's been typical statistics formulated to suggest acceptable levels of reliability. For the subtests or the smaller scores that compose the larger score, the more meaningful score, it's usually 0.8. For a total score on an instrument, 0.9. However, when you're talking about this kind of critical decision around special education placement and diagnosis of something as significant as ASD, it suggested that that kind of reliability in the instrument you're choosing to use be at least 0.95, just to be ever more comfortable, I should say, that you're using an instrument that's giving you good results. So moving from that brief review of reliability to validity, this is, of course, the most critical piece. And that's how much can we trust the interpretation of the scores to be true to what we are supposing they measure. That means the questions have to be spot on, very carefully designed and clear so that the answer relates directly to the question and is not misinterpreted. And it's really difficult with the diagnosis of ASD, given how complex it is, but also how the criteria that we are using to describe it is ever evolving, as it seems. So a brief look at how the instruments are developed, and it's very logical. Starting with that definition, which again has morphed quite a lot over the last several decades. You then develop an initial pool of questions that are piloted again and again until there's enough confidence that they do in fact operationalize what you're trying to measure. So that's done on a continuing basis until you're at a comfortable level. And once that level of feeling confident about the questions themselves has been reached, then the standardization process would begin with a well-chosen sample population in order to get those norms and then to finally establish the reliability and validity of the instrument as it's been designed. Again, we've got new screening tools looking to really capture these more subtle impairments that we're seeing at the very mild end of the spectrum. It takes a lot of in-depth assessment, obviously, to make an identification. So initially we start only at the screening level. And to interpret these instruments, it's assumed that you have a very solid background in ASD and in administering the instruments, scoring the instruments, and interpreting their results. So not anyone could ask the questions, get the answers, score the instrument, and interpret its results. There's a need for a real refined clinical judgmental piece as well. So 7 instruments are going to be incorporated into the coverage of this module. They're the ones most used. You'll find that professionals prefer some instruments over others. There might be some mixed reviews on some of them, but they are the ones most often identified as quality instruments. And so they're all questionnaires. There's a lot of information provided for you about each of them. On the following slides, I've listed the 7, given you some additional websites, or there's more information in your textbooks perhaps, or there's more information again within the module. These links, because they're not always working on YouTube, are also in a document within this module so that you can go to those and upload it and get to each of the links. So I encourage you to look at each of them. So you will see on the next several slides the names, a little bit of information, and an additional site very often that you can go to. The SRS has been revised since your textbook was published. Again, both of your texts, while they're the best texts I could find, are not up to the moment with the most recent changes due to when they were published, obviously. So the SRS has been revised, and I've given you a link about those revisions, and there's also information on the original version in your text. The suggested steps in screening is what we're going to finish up with here. If you're going to use these instruments, some of the experts suggest the use of certain instruments along the process at certain times. On this slide, you'll see those that are suggested for the very initial screening, and a caution that there's always some error, so there's still the possibility of some false negatives. So if you have a student, you use one of these screeners, but you continue even though the screener comes back with, not an indication of ASD or the need for further assessment. You want to continue to monitor that student because it could be that future assessment is indeed necessary. If that's apparent initially from your scores on first screener, numbers 2 on this slide indicates the instruments that they suggest look more closely at the degree of symptoms that the student might be displaying. And then what threshold you use for referral. So of course you'll be working with a team of professionals if you're involved in such a process, and it would be a team decision that enough evidence is presented that a referral to greater assessment is indicated for a particular student. Other things to consider, though, again, are really knowing the psychometrics of your instrument and checking into gender differences that should be reported. It's typical for boys to have a higher mean on a lot of these instruments than girls, and taking that into your consideration and judgment in the decisions to move further. Again, every instrument has error despite efforts to really produce a quality, highly reliable and valid instrument. There's error in every instrument. So also collecting a lot of information in addition to this, and that's an obvious point, but getting all the information you can from parents and other individuals who work with the child and know the child. And again, I mentioned before, these are not screeners that we use universally, like you might use a screener for something else in a school setting, obviously. These are screeners used only as indicated by those either predispositions or red flags that we mentioned earlier.